So now that we've added a few strands, let's go over how to shape them. So the grooming tools that we've used so far are add and remove. Now let's go over a few of the other tools. Scatter will add a large number of strands on the mesh. Comb shapes the strand by increasing the curvature of the strand. So as you start to apply the comb tool, you can see how it starts to curve in the direction of the stroke. We can adjust the influence of the brush on the strand's base and tip. So if we dropped the base strength to 0, the tool will only affect the tip of the strand. Another tool that is useful is the direction tool. The direction tool allows you to change the direction of the strand by having it pivot from the base. So you can, in essence, spin the strand and you won't actually be changing the shape of it. Straighten, when used in small increments, can help you dial in a change to the strand. So if you continually apply the tool, it'll eventually reset its shape. The smooth tool tries to average points to soften the overall shape of the strand. As with the straighten tool, if you keep applying the smooth, it'll completely drain the shape out of the strand. For instances where a strand is crashing through the mesh, or you want to lift it up from the surface, you can apply the lift tool. You can adjust the tool's influence on the base and tip, so this almost functions as a reverse comb tool. The move tool is a very useful tool. When you want to adjust the placement of a strand, you can simply translate the strand across the surface of the mesh. As you use a tool to move a strand across the surface, it'll bring any strands in its path along for the ride. Which brings me to the topic of strand selection. In order to limit the influence of a tool to a specific strand, you can select it by pressing Control and left mouse click. To deselect the strand, it's Control and middle mouse click. Now that we have a strand selected, the move tool will not affect any of the adjacent strands. Now, if we're done with the selection, under the tool settings, if you go down to workflow tools, we have a deselect all tool. Click it once and strand selections will be cleared. It's easy to forget that you have active strands selected and it may seem like a tool is not working. So normally clicking this will remedy the issue. And again, you can also just Control middle mouse click to deselect all the strands. If you need to adjust the size of a strand, select the scale tool and click on a strand. With the scale tool specifically, you will almost always want to drop the input strength to a fairly low number. Otherwise, the scale will be so high that the strand explodes off frame. If you want to reverse scale a strand, you will need to enter a negative value in the strength. This should reduce the strand in size. The clump tool will attract all nearby strands to a single point. In this case, we have a negative value, so it's pushing the strands away from each other. So let's bring the value to a positive. And now you'll notice that it'll start to clump the strands together. With the twist tool, we can curl any selected strands. It's handy if you are grooming a character with curly hair. The tangent tool will try to shape the strand as perpendicular to the surface normal as possible. So the more you apply this tool onto any selected strands, the closer to the surface tangent it'll become. The sculpt tool is a tool that we will be using the most. This tool allows you to shape the strand in any way that you need. If we sculpt the strand towards the surface, you'll notice that it starts to collide with the mesh. If you don't want the strand to collide with the mesh, you can just turn on the disable surface collision option, and now you can see that we're able to push the strand past the growth surface. If you want to limit the tool's influence on strands only facing the camera, you want to turn on obey surface normals. This is helpful if you don't want to affect strands that are on the other side of the mesh. You may find that having this on doesn't always help the way that you'd want it. So we could always leave it off and select the curves that you want to sculpt. And finally, we have the cut or trim tool. It'll reduce the length of the strands to the outer edge of the tool's radius. Any strands that fall within its radius of influence will get cut down to size. If you want to resample after trimming a strand, we can isolate said strand and resample. Now that we've covered how to shape a strand, let's take the tools for a test run and actually give Kurt some hair like, say, a mohawk.